talk to be given by David Spence. I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and I would request that all of you keep your microphones muted. We're anticipating a very large group for this event, so we really appreciate your attendance and participation. So this event is being co-sponsored by the Risk Center at Wharton, specifically by the Business, Climate, and Environment Lab, as well as the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at Penn, at the Design School. My name is Sarah Light. I'm an associate professor of legal studies and business ethics, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this event today with David Spence. I see a number of my students' names on the participant list, so welcome, and welcome to everyone from the Penn community as well as members of the public who may be here today. I just want to take one moment, since I'm one of the faculty leads from the Business, Climate, and Environment Lab, which is co-hosting the event, to introduce the lab and to explain that the lab, which was launched in the spring, is here at Wharton to promote cutting-edge research and thought leadership on public policy and private strategies related to environmental issues, including climate change. And so we are absolutely delighted that our first event here is during Climate Week at Penn, and that we have the opportunity to welcome David Spence. So let me introduce Professor Spence to you all. David Spence is the Baker Botts Chair in Law at the University of Texas School of Law and a professor of Business, Government, and Society at the University of Texas Austin McCombs School of Business. Professor Spence's research and teaching focuses on government regulation of the energy industry, broadly defined to include economic and environmental regulation of the entire energy sector. He is co-author of the leading energy law textbook and one of the principals behind energytradeoffs.com, a website featuring research that addresses the complexity and trade-offs associated with the green energy transition. Professor Spence earned his PhD in political science from Duke University and his JD from the University of North Carolina School of Law and his BA from Gettysburg College. We are so delighted to have David here today. I will be moderating the Q&A. The way that this will work is David will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A. I will look for questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will sort of moderate the Q&A. And then David will speak again for about 10 minutes. There will be another Q&A session, and then a third talk followed by Q&A. So with that introduction, I turn this over to David.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you to the Wharton Risk Center and to the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy for sponsoring this talk today. And you see here on this slide the website that Sarah referenced, energytradeoffs.com, which was started by a group of legal scholars, of which I'm a part, who support a rapid energy transition, let's say to a net zero carbon emission economy by mid-century, but who are also concerned about powerful centrifugal forces in the political environment today that are frankly fracturing our democracy right now, but we think are also causing parts of the pro-climate coalition to, let's say, lose the plot in some ways. That is, to fail to face some of the difficult choices, trade-offs that we're going to have to make on the way to a net zero future. So that's what the website's about. That's what this talk is about, because we think that facing those choices now facilitates a transition rather than hinders it. That the website focuses on research that grapples with those trade-offs in a concrete or granular way. And if you agree with that idea, you'll please visit the site. I hope you will. If you don't, and then this talk may not be your cup of tea. Likewise, if you don't believe that a transition is urgent and necessary, that this talk probably won't be your cup of tea either. So let me start by showing you a quote from the website. And I'm not advancing my slides. Uh-oh, let's see here. There we go. This is one of the many quotes we have on the website. It comes from the movie Lincoln, and it illustrates the general point I'm trying to make here. In the movie, you may remember that when the radical Republicans are upset with Lincoln for being cautious about pursuing the 13th Amendment, they accuse him of lacking a moral compass. And this quote is his response. He says that a compass will point you where you need the direction you need to go, but it's not going to show you the obstacles that you're going to need to navigate to get to your destination. In his words, the swamps and chasms and deserts and so forth. And we're not going to get to net zero by 2050 in this country without national climate legislation. And members of Congress are going to have to answer to voters who will want to understand the swamps and chasms of an energy transition. So this talk is really about not so much a particular solution, but rather about the political environment that's conducive to finding a solution. And as Sarah said, I'm going to do this in 3 parts. The first part discusses the familiar trade-offs that we've always known about in the energy sector. I'm arguing that they still exist and they still remain important despite the urgency of the task, and that we ought to avoid thinking about these problems or the transition in ways that brush those trade-offs aside. In the second part, I'm going to talk about how the environment today of political discussion makes us all particularly susceptible to narratives that steer our gaze away from those difficult problems and choices. The reasons that that happens have to do with the way political polarization, social media, and 24-hour news influence the way we form beliefs and talk about our beliefs. And in the third part, I'll talk about why I think that soft pedaling these distributional choices now can undermine the task of building the kind of legislative majority we need to pass climate legislation in the future, particularly given the kind of Congress we're likely to have. And so that's the basic organization of the talk. Let me get into this first part here. So we've long understood that there's a tension between ensuring a reliable supply of energy, making it affordable, and making it clean. Technological change in recent years has made some of those trade-offs easier, but it hasn't eliminated them entirely. So if we assume that for politicians, the reliability of the energy supply is non-negotiable, getting to net zero across all of the sectors of our economy in a time of historic economic inequality means that we have to pay attention to cost, and that we ought, I would say, ethically to pay attention to cost as well. So, but the good news here is that there are some win-win opportunities. People have long talked about the fact that energy efficiency investments represent win-win opportunities. People can save money and help the environment at the same time. And on the generation side of the electricity sector in particular, wind and solar power are now the cheapest forms of power we have, at least on a levelized cost basis. Levelized costs means that if these types of generators are able to sell all of their output, they can do so at prices that allow them to at least break even, and prices that are lower than any other technology. So they're cheaper in that respect. And as you can see here from this graph, there's lots of room in the market for wind and solar to grow, to displace dirtier forms of generation, and do so very inexpensively, probably bringing power prices down along the way. So those are win-win opportunities. We've even found that the intermittency of wind and solar hasn't been as big a problem as we thought it would be. Grid engineers used to worry that integrating wind and solar would upset reliability at very relatively low levels of penetration. That hasn't been the case. That's all the good news, but it doesn't follow from this that a zero emission electric grid is cheaper than the one we have now. And at very high levels of renewables, these kinds of reliability problems do get a bit dicey, making these trade-offs a lot more difficult. If we include social costs like pollution, a zero emission grid probably is cheaper than the current grid. But if we focus on the kind of out-of-pocket costs that consumers care about and that their elected representatives therefore care about, it's probably not cheaper. And certainly an all renewables grid is going to be more expensive than a technology neutral zero emission grid. You've probably all seen studies that show grid designs that are either all renewable or are at least have no nuclear and no fossil fuels associated with them, that prove that we can build a zero emission grid, and and argue that that kind of grid is cheaper on a full social cost basis. But because wind and solar only generate power when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, these systems have to be a lot bigger than the current grid. And they will have to include a lot of generators whose output is stored for use later and who don't get to sell very much of their power. They're rarely needed. They'll also need to include a lot of transmission lines to connect all of this geographically dispersed new infrastructure. So all of that means that the levelized cost of the total set of generators is going to be a lot higher. And we have conversations on the trade-off site about this from modelers who try to model the out-of-pocket costs of different zero-emission grid configurations and explain, why it is that a zero-emission grid has to be bigger and has to be more costly. There are other kinds of costs involved with a rapid transition as well. We have to decide where to put all of this infrastructure. And that often triggers NIMBY, not in my backyard, opposition. We seem to have, at least in certain parts of the country, NIMBY vetoes built into our regulatory approval system. New England and New York, for example, intend to build a lot of wind and to build transmission to bring clean hydropower down from Quebec. But they have a lot of trouble overcoming local opposition in the siting process for that infrastructure, and so far haven't made a whole lot of progress toward their goal. That leads some people to say, if we can't site this big infrastructure quickly enough, maybe we should make consumers more responsible for ensuring a reliable supply by requiring or incentivizing distributed generation or storage. That's another way of redistributing the costs of the system, putting the onus on consumers, building it into buildings, or requiring consumers to provide sort of reliability safeguards. If we do either of those things, either build out this big new grid or try to decentralize the grid or both, we have to wonder whether the new costs will fall on the poor people the same way that the costs of climate change tend to disproportionately affect poor people. Or will we be able to attend to those distributional issues up front? But more generally, I think it's true that if you restrict the solution set, if you rule out certain types of zero emission solutions, you're going to increase your costs. And even in the face of a climate emergency, I would argue that costs matter, or at least they matter to those with fewer dollars and to the elected representatives of those with fewer dollars. Probably most people saw the news today that California is going to ban the sale of internal combustion cars by 2035. That's good news for the climate, and we can think of it as merely stopping one of the many ways that we shift environmental externalities to society. But it also means that some people are going to have to pay more for transport than they otherwise would have. And in a state built for cars and facing social stress caused by extreme wealth disparities, that's not a trivial question to ask about. And what worries us, those of us that run the website, is that we see the debate becoming, the pro-climate debate becoming factionalized, with teams, Team Nuclear, Team Renewables, Team Green New Deal. And debate, of course, is healthy, but some of these teams have become such technology partisans that they choose to oppose progress that would reduce emissions that doesn't necessarily follow their team's particular prescription. And that's the thing we're hoping to tamp down a little bit with this message. And here's just some examples of the kind of narratives you see in this sort of technology team environment. And I'm happy to talk about these in the Q&A period if you like. To a lesser extent, there's also a little bit of factional sort of team approaches to regulatory instruments. There are people who think that there's only one way to get to net zero. It has to be a carbon tax, or it has to be a clean energy standard, or it has to be this or that. We don't want to become policy instrument partisans either. We want to keep our eyes on the prize, which is emissions and minimizing emissions. And that's what we ought to be paying attention to. The fact is, we are terrible at predicting what options will be cheap, affordable, scalable, effective, even 10, 15 years in the future. We don't foresee technological change that easily or that well. And so we should, I argue, be agnostic about these things. Sometimes I hear people respond to this message with a certain amount of skepticism. they'll say things like, we're in a crisis now, and you're talking about downsides and costs and trade-offs. That is a kind of defeatist way of looking at this, and it plays into the hands of opponents of climate change legislation, and there just isn't any time for that. You're like the soldier charging up Omaha Beach on D-Day asking his sergeant if he's sure this is the right beach. That's not helpful. Plus, you're from Texas. Don't think I don't know what you're trying to do. I'm just kidding about that last part. So I have rejoinders to that argument in the second and third parts of this talk. And in the next part, I want to try and convince you that if you are dismissive of challenges to your own preferred climate policy solutions, whether it's regulatory instruments or technologies, it's partly because the environment in which we talk about these issues nowadays is steering you toward that kind of dismissiveness. And I want to explain that in the second part of the talk, but with that sort of hint about what's to come, I'll stop there and take questions.
Okay, terrific. So I'm the curator and the asker of the questions. So we have one question. Feel free to type questions into the chat. So far, the first question that we've received is the following. Have you taken into account the argument that electrifying everything will greatly reduce the amount of energy that we need and or use across the economy? So we wouldn't have to overbuild as much as thought, at least not based on current energy usage numbers.
I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. Electricity is another way of delivering energy services, right? And if when people talk about electrifying everything, they're normally talking about transitioning from the use of, say, natural gas for heating and cooking in the home or in manufacturing processes to electricity. Perhaps the questioner is referring to the idea that electricity, the delivery by way of electricity will be more expensive for some of these customers than delivering by way of fossil fuels, which are particularly efficient ways of storing energy. You can use them, they give you a lot of energy per volume. Perhaps because it'll be more expensive, we'll use less of it. I'm not quite sure what the questioner is asking about there, but it's definitely true that as price goes up, consumption goes down. And we argue that, or I argue, I shouldn't speak for others, but I argue that as price goes up, consumption goes down, and that's good. But I worry about states like mine that don't do a very good job of protecting the vulnerable, the economically vulnerable when price goes up.
Okay, next question relates to nuclear power. So the broad context is how important is nuclear to all of this? And relatedly, why is it that we are reluctant to use more nuclear power to support renewables as we promote renewable energy electrification?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's got a complicated answer, and I'll try to do it. I'll try to answer briefly. And by the way, I'm happy to hang around later if anybody wants to keep asking these questions. But so nuclear is relatively expensive on a levelized cost basis right now. There are advocates of nuclear who believe that the next generation of nuclear reactors could be made more cheap than the current generation if they could achieve production economies of scale. And I'm mostly talking about small modular reactors here, but there are other technologies that nuclear boosters boost. So part of its problem is how expensive it is. The other part is how people relate to the risk of accidents in nuclear power. There's a huge literature on the disconnect between the quantifiable risk of nuclear power and the perception of risk of nuclear power. People don't want them in their backyard. Healthy minority of states have outlawed the construction of new nuclear power plants in their borders. It's a complicated artifact of the history of nuclear power and its connection to nuclear weapons, I think. But if you look at the sort of lethality of different types of electric generation, coal-fired power has killed many, 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 many more people than nuclear ever has, but nuclear seems to generate more intense fears for some reason. And so As I said, I'm technology agnostic here. So nuclear at the generation stage is a zero emission technology, and I'd love to see it developed.
Okay, so we now have a series of questions that relate to distributive justice and environmental justice. The big question is, can you talk about the potential distributive justice issues involved from this transition? That might include everything from, are we properly accounting for the benefits of replacing refineries and these stationary sources with green energy? Are we considering the sourcing of raw materials from other countries, in particular the developing world? And can you talk about the implications, generally speaking, about trade-offs? For example, the case of biofuels that might be replacing crops grown for food that could lead to food shortages. So generally, if you could talk about the distributive justice and environmental justice implications, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so great question again. And as the question implies, there are distributive justice and environmental justice issues on all sides of this transition, right? So it's absolutely true that polluting installations like refineries tend to be more likely to be located in poor and minority neighborhoods. So if they are shut down as a result of a transition, that's a benefit to those neighborhoods. Climate change tends, although not exclusively, but tends to disproportionately affect poorer people. It's also true that the minerals and the upstream sort of externalities associated with solar power, which mainly happen in other countries, also with batteries, involve mining and pollution that also tends to affect disproportionately poorer people. And even the transition here in the sort of developed, the sort of wealthy part of our country, things like, people argue that, well, there's a longer conversation to be had about whether net metering, for example, is regressive net metering that is paying retail rates to owners of solar power units who are on their roof that sell their excess power to the grid, paying them retail rates and paying the utility scale solar a wholesale rate that can leave generally less wealthy people paying them a larger share of the cost of operating the grid. There's injustice issues and distributive issues all over this transition on both sides, or all sides. And I think that's a great question that I'm not concise enough to be able to completely answer in the time allotted. But I'm happy to connect with the questioner afterwards to sort of point them to resources if they would like to read them.
Okay, the next question relates to batteries. Have you taken into account improving battery technology in terms of how this affects the capacity that we would need in a purely renewable grid? For example, lithium-ion battery packs have decreased dramatically in price per kilowatt hour in the last decade, and this is likely to continue. If battery technology is cheap, are we able to have a lower capacity renewables grid that still meets our needs in a way that addresses some of these or minimizes some of these trade-offs?
Yeah, so there's a whole sort of vision of the future that makes logical sense that involves more batteries on the system in the right places, plus the right price incentives or other incentives that can drastically reduce sort of the need for peaking plants and the need for capacity, just total generating capacity can be much smaller because you are smartly sort of placing and using storage. Batteries have come down in price rapidly, kind of following a cost reduction curve similar to solar. How far and how much longer that will go on is debated and debatable. My levelized cost estimate box there included solar PV plus storage. That was basically solar PV plus a 4-hour battery, if I recall correctly. So that would be a plant together that could provide you with power for when the sun is up and for 4 additional hours. That number is still quite high compared to other generation sources when you add the storage into it. So I think it's entirely possible that batteries could solve a lot of the size of the grid problem, but and so I'd be happy for them to do that. So I think what I'm saying is that if we're agnostic technologically and we say, look, we're just going to get to a zero emission grid and we're going to let all these technologies compete to get there, given the geographical heterogeneity of our system, Different things will be tried in different places and will work better in different places. But if we insist on zero emission, we'll probably get there the cheapest way, the least expensive way.
Great. So I'm going to ask the last question for this section before we move on to your next segment of the presentation. And that is, how do you even build a system like this so big so quickly?
Yeah, that's a big challenge. We have a lot of barriers to entry for transmission in particular. It's hard to build the transmission. This new system, any kind of heavily renewable system, would require a lot of transmission lines. And so this great opportunity for win-win, sort of cheap, clean power is being held up in places by the inability to site transmission, which is typically vetoed at the state level. We don't have a federal siting regime for transmission. And I wrote an op-ed in the Regulatory Review, which is a Penn blog, years ago on this, but it is very difficult to overcome NIMBY opposition. And we have to face the fact that building out a clean energy system is going to require us to force infrastructure on communities that don't want it, to put it bluntly. We have to build this. We have to build stuff, and there's never a place that usually says, "Come on, build it here." Right? And so, yeah, that's a kind of glib answer. I don't mean it to sound glib, but in the time allotted, that's the best I can do. All
right. We will end the Q&A session for this segment and move on to the next segment of your presentation.
Okay, great. So let me just start by saying, I don't think we are charging up Omaha Beach just yet. We're discussing what climate policy ought to look like at the same time that we're trying to rally support for it, and we can do both, even if the two things are in tension with one another. And this quote from the father of the current governor of New York and the former governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, sort of tries to make that point. But if by inspiring you, a leader misleads you, that leader, may earn a temporary victory, but at the cost of your trust. And so I think great leaders inspire and they educate. And I don't know who the great athletic coaches were in the history of the University of Pennsylvania Fighting Quakers, which is my favorite oxymoronic team nickname of all time. But I'm sure that they not only inspired their players, but they were also ruthlessly analytical about identifying the obstacles that were in the team's path, helping the players understand those obstacles and how to address them. And because of your expertise as Penn students and faculty, you are all policy leaders at some level. And I hope that desire to face these sort of granular difficulties is part of how you approach these issues. So the problem today is illustrated by this equation, which is I tried to make, grabby in terms of pictures. But basically, political conditions today favor appeals to our lesser angels, and they make those appeals more effective than they've ever been before. This equation you see here is distorting our own perception of our perception of issues and of each other, as I'm sure you already know, which makes it harder and harder to engage different points of view and to think critically about what you want and what we want, and to be self-critical, to have to use your critical faculties to dissect your own preferences. You've heard about a post-truth world. That was a term of art in the last election that was all over the news, and it's true. We have no doubt, or no difficulty, I should say, discovering this dynamic, these biases at work in the words and opinions of others, but it's really hard for us to detect it in ourselves, which is not to suggest that these effects are symmetrical across the political spectrum, across partisan and ideological lines, but neither are they absent from any part of the political spectrum as well. And so I want to explain what I mean by this equation in this second part of the talk. This is a famous quote from Federalist number 10, and it's a way of saying that political philosophers have always understood that what we want influences what we believe. It's how we humans are wired. And so politicians and lobbyists have always crafted their appeals in ways that capitalize on this wiring and try to shape what we see in our mind's eye when we think about political issues or actors, and to induce positive feelings about some things and negative feelings about other things. And if they can do that, then they don't have to work as hard to get us to focus on the facts they want us to focus on and to turn our gaze away from the facts they don't want us to focus on. And if you've studied behavioral psychology and cultural anthropology and all the social sciences that have contributed to the literature on heuristics and biases, you know that that literature sort of fleshes out and explains all these biases that those who would lobby us can trigger to influence the pictures we have in our mind's eye of particular issues or people or politically relevant issues or politically relevant people. And it's a fascinating literature, but it's mainly explaining and fleshing out the dynamics that these professional politicians like James Madison understood intuitively. So this political dynamic isn't new. What's new, at least in my lifetime, is that political polarization is supercharging this dynamic, these effects. And it's making the task of persuasion a lot easier for those who lobby us. This data is commonly used data that puts members of Congress on a left-right spectrum, but this particular graph is measuring how far apart ideologically the parties are in Congress. So the further up the graph you go, the farther apart the congressional parties are. And as you can see, at least for the time period covered here, we are at unprecedented levels of ideological distance between the parties, which makes the need to win feel ever more urgent because the other side's agenda seems alarming or even disastrous. I know I sometimes feel this way, and I imagine many of you do too. But the point is that active partisans in both parties feel this way about the other. And I think we're seeing this right now. This sense of extreme urgency is part of what's caused the ongoing breakdown of fairness norms in the filling of Supreme Court vacancies, for example. So this emotion, this polarization creates emotion that supercharges our biases, and modern media supercharges them even further, or helps us supercharge our own biases even further. And I'm going to sort of step back a second here. If you think about the way we gathered information that was relevant to forming political beliefs a long time ago, for most of the 20th century, the mass media was kind of a centralizing force. It was populated by journalists who aspired to objectivity and double-checked and triple-checked their sources before publishing stories. And they could do that because they weren't giving us news very often. We were getting a daily paper, a daily newscast, weekly news magazine. It was like they brewed the tea very carefully and gave it to us in little cups, and we sipped it and savored it. We read each story or listened to each story in full. And that's not how things work anymore. Now we get our information online and it comes to us in a torrent. When we seek it out or when we don't, it comes to us in a torrent. And much of that information is uncurated, designed to persuade us rather than to inform us. And it's coming not only from the same kind of journalists we used before, but also from advocates who are not necessarily giving us a warts and all picture of some issue or problem or policy solution. So it's harder to separate the curated information from the propaganda these days. It's more difficult than ever. And there's so much of it that we don't feel like we have the time to digest it fully and slowly, to read to the last paragraph or even the second paragraph some of the time. And that's a big problem because deeply understanding an issue requires grappling with the complexities and the caveats and all the qualifications associated with that issue. And you don't get that except by reading to the 20th paragraph or the last paragraph. So even if you still go search, let's say you go searching for reputable sources and you read to the 20th paragraph, the information you see online is still more likely to be censored because we tend, as you already know, probably, we tend to click on the stories that support our prior beliefs more often than the ones that don't. The social media algorithms learn about this and they give us more of what we like and less of what we don't like. So what that means is that all these forces, these biases, the ramped up emotion associated with polarization, the fragmented media environment, they conspire to hide from us some of the messy downsides and complexities associated with the things we want, the trade-offs associated with the green transition, for example. But more importantly, we lose the habit of even looking for that complexity, and that makes our critical thinking muscles tend to atrophy a little bit, at least with respect to the things we want to be true. And beyond just sort of how we gather information, the way we form beliefs historically has been a social process. And that's changed too. It used to be we talked to neighbors and family, coworkers, friends about the news before forming opinions. And we did that in person. And so that gave us all the nuance that face-to-face communication gives us. Now we do it online. And I have just a couple of points about online communities I want to make. First of all, you probably have already understand that these communities tend to be more ideologically homogenous than the rest of the world, which means that we tend to form and not only form beliefs more quickly, but firm them up more quickly. We develop a kind of orthodoxy within our filter bubble online. And in some social media environments, we tend to chase away dissenters or to exit those groups where we feel like we've been chased away. That's point number one. Point number two is that a growing literature is showing that falsehoods travel farther and faster than truths do online, and that emotional messages travel farther and faster as well. This is how we come to believe, smart people can come to believe so firmly in falsehoods. We see this in others so easily, but we don't think it's possible that it can happen to us. And we need to audit our beliefs in order to prevent that from happening. And the third thing I want to say is that online conversations are less honest than real life conversations for the same reason that reality TV is less honest than reality. The presence of a potential audience online makes us conscious to the fact that what we're saying is being evaluated by other people that we don't know, and that just sort of engages the part of us that wants to persuade. We stop thinking about exchanging views and learning, and we start thinking more about persuasion. We all become lobbyists, emphasizing the dimensions of a problem that we think are going to persuade people to our point of view and de-emphasizing the other parts of the problem. And when that happens, we stop learning from one another. And the saddest thing about this for me, from my point of view, is in the climate debate, is that I see people and even colleagues who are avoiding and sometimes even shutting down discussion of issues that don't, quote, help the cause, close quote. So I think we can be educators and we can be advocates, but we can't be both of those things at the same time. And then if you've seen this documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, the insidiousness and the power of all this is really well illustrated there. The trailer's tagline is if everyone is entitled to their own facts, then there's really no reason for people to get together. And that's a scary thought. So I think the way we fight this is we sort of we be on the lookout for contempt narratives, what I call contempt narratives. We look for warning signs. We audit the pictures we have in our own mind's eye. Ask, am I too emotionally attached to this or that particular belief about climate policy? Might there be reasonable alternatives? Is it stopping me from engaging in debates on the merits of my point of view? Am I broadly dismissive of entire classes of people or of those who challenge my beliefs? Are there actors in this climate world that I completely write off and won't talk to? Those are all bad signs as far as I'm concerned. And you know, if we feel like we have contempt for particular actors or technologies or industries or those who favor a particular regulatory instrument, I would suggest that we all, check that picture in our mind's eye and think about whether it was influenced by, something that we ought not to have been influenced by. And I'll close this part of a talk by just saying that, if you have those kinds of feelings about aspects of the climate debate, I would go looking for someone to challenge them, and if you can defend them, great. If you can't, then maybe you'll adjust your point of view. I'll stop there.
All right, terrific. We are now at the second question and answer segment, so feel free to begin typing questions into the chat on this topic. So, David, you've given this presentation about our biases and the way that what we want shapes what we believe, and that's certainly a topic that students and faculty here at Wharton are extremely familiar with. From your perspective, are these trends mutable? And if so, how? I mean, you've suggested, generally speaking, that individuals ought to look closely in the mirror at the biases that we might have, but that we don't always acknowledge. But on a broader scale, do you think that it is possible to change, or do you see some of these problems as immutable?
I think they're Well, I think they're both changeable and preventable. So I wouldn't, so it's a couple of things. Don't get your information or process your information on Twitter. Twitter filter bubbles can often get really insulated, and seek out sources of information that are varied. I'm really thinking about the climate debate now. So seek out sources of information that are varied, react skeptically to intensely condemnatory narratives. There are parts of at each ideological pole where you encounter these narratives all the time. I see it on, evening sort of shows on Fox News, and I see it in certain parts of progressive Twitter. I see it in both places. And I think almost always, most people are not cartoon villains, as I used the example I used on the slide. Most people are complicated. Most actors do things for reasons that are far less simple or far less morally simple than some of these narratives suggest. And so I would sort of be skeptical of narratives that you encounter that frame things in that way. On the climate side, I think I would resist. Yeah, so I would look for varied sources of information. I would find heterogeneous groups or different groups to talk to about these issues. This is a much worse problem outside of the sort of academic environment than it is inside the academic environment. In other words, the job description of most of your professors is that they should be providing you with that kind of variety, right? If there's an unsettled issue in the literature, in the academic literature, they should be giving you a representative sample. And so you're going to get some of that as a student in a university setting. You're not going to get that once you go out into the world. And you're going to have to work to create that variety. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. I mean, if you can read The Economist and The Atlantic, or something that gives you multiple perspectives, it will help you retain your ability to critically analyze both perspectives. I hope that wasn't too vague.
So you referred to the idea of seeking out different sources of information, and there's an entire literature within about the ways in which people seek out sources whom they trust and are more inclined to believe sources that they trust. I'm curious, from your perspective, are there any sources out there, particularly in the United States, that are considered to be trustworthy on both sides of the partisan divide, that have perspectives on climate change and the green energy transition that you think perhaps ought to become more important in this debate because they are respected on both sides, because they present the facts in an even way?
Well, that's a great question. And I think so first of all, let me just say we link on the front page of the website, but at the bottom, a bunch of sources, including the Kleinman Center. And these are places that we feel like we see fair treatments of these transition issues. For me, another one of those is the Environmental Defense Fund. But let me just say, as that popped into my head, I know that the Environmental Defense Fund takes grief sometimes from its left flank. And then when they reach sort of strong environmental conclusions, they take grief from the right. So I'm not sure that there's anything that everyone trusts anymore, but there are places that garner trust from a broader part of the ideological spectrum than other sources do. We also link Resources for the Future, which is a great source of analysis. And so those links are sort of newsy and analytical places people can go. On the climate, the rest of anything else that pops into my head costs money, right? So there's also trade press that costs money, and my school pays for it. So that's not necessarily something that they cost a lot of money, and so I'm not going to necessarily mention them. But if you can get them through the university, I think roughly I would say E&E Daily, Environment and Energy Daily, is a good source of information as well.
We have a few questions in the chat. I think this will be the last question on this part. People who have made efforts to seek out debate on climate change, what do you do? What are you supposed to do when you have a discussion with someone who does not acknowledge basic facts about climate science? So for example, that climate change that we are currently experiencing is part of a natural cycle and not anthropogenic, which obviously is a position that is in conflict with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports. How do you propose that people should engage in that kind of conversation?
Yeah, I don't think there's, if somebody is determined to deny what essentially all experts in a field say is reality, there's not a lot you can do, right? What you can do is you can ask why they do that. You know, if 97 doctors told you that this was your problem and 3 said it was something else, why would you go to the 3? You know, or you can ask why, you can sort of interrogate that belief, and if nothing else, that might, if they continue talking to you, give you a little bit of an insight into how they got to think the way they think. But I don't have any illusions that you're going to persuade people who have adopted anti-climate science as part of their identity. People don't yield on those kinds of identity issues very easily. And one of the major problems that we face is that, you know, a segment of the Republican that kind of identity, and that's very different gains that can be made at the margins in at least of the Republican Party and the conservative part of the political spectrum. But I'm not suggesting that you know, you argue with someone who says when you ask them how Mexico is going to pay for the wall, they say the wall just got 10 feet taller. That's not really an answer, right? So at that point, it just becomes sort of tribal, and I'm not sure that you can have a productive discussion there. But that doesn't mean you can't have a productive discussion with everybody, with anyone rather, who opposes climate change. There may be some that you can. In fact, I'm confident that there are some that you can.
All right, well, on a positive note, right before we go back into your last segment of presentation, one of our participants noted in the chat that Penn provides energy environment news to students, and that it is a great resource, and there's a link to the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy website. And there's also a direct link for those of you who are off campus. I read that every day. It is a very comprehensive news source. All right, let us proceed to your third section on legislative politics.
Okay, so this is a picture of Ted Halstead, who died recently at a very young age, tragically, who has been a champion of climate bipartisanship. And he gave a TED Talk that got a lot of views, the tagline of which was, "The path to climate progress leads through the Republican Party." I'm not really sure that's true, but I think the underlying point there is that the path to national legislation on climate certainly leads through the ideological center of Congress, of both the House and the Senate. That's sort of an unavoidable truth in a system that is governed by majority rule. And so in Congress, you're going to see representatives of people from every one of those filter bubbles, including the unreasonable ones. And so engagement across some of those lines is going to be necessary to build a legislative majority. And I decided to go back and look at periods of time, or look at major regulatory legislation that comprises a big chunk of the regulatory state. And historically speaking, Congress has not generally been so inclined to pass major regulatory legislation, the kind that really changes the distribution of costs and benefits in the economy. Its willingness to do that kind of thing has been confined to relatively short periods in our history. So you see a lot of bills here, but they were all passed in very limited periods of time. I've identified 3 sort of heavily regulatory eras here. One is the 30 years surrounding the turn of the 20th century. The second is the 6 short years of the New Deal. And the third is basically the 1970s plus a few acts on either side of the 1970s. So Congress is relatively infrequently inclined to do this kind of thing, but they do it, and they do it in bunches when they are so inclined. And that makes these kinds of situations interesting to policy scholars, certainly. And policy scholars have coined a lot of terms that you see here to describe situations in which issues become particularly salient to the public, and there's a huge public outcry for regulation that becomes strong enough that Congress eventually takes action. You can Google these if you want further explanation of them. And so when we look back at these bills, and we look back at what Congress does when these outcries happen, what we find is that the outcry itself is not enough. What you need also is a receptive Congress, and when I say receptive, I mean receptive in terms of either the partisan makeup or the ideological makeup of Congress, such that almost all the bills you see on this screen passed with much more than bare legislative majorities in each house. So this kind of stronger majority historically has happened in either of two ways. One is when there's massive party dominance in one-party dominance in Congress and a president of the same party. And so the New Deal is sort of the classic example of this. The smallest margins that Democrats had during the entire 6 years of the New Deal, the smallest margins were 23 seats in the Senate and 126 seats in the House. That is, there were 23 more Democrats in the Senate than Republicans, 126 more Democrats in the House than Republicans. Huge majorities. Wasn't that huge during the progressive era, the part that's circled here, but they were certainly strong majorities then as well. We're probably not going to get that here in this country anytime soon, at least in the Senate. We might in the House. This is Nate Silver earlier this week talking about the replacement of Justice Ginsburg, but making a point about the bias in the Senate that has been true lately and seems to be getting even stronger toward rural areas. That is, rural voters are overrepresented in Senate elections, and rural voters tend to be more conservative. So we're probably not going to get huge majorities in the Senate, at least not in the next election or the next two elections. So that makes us want to look at the other situation in which larger majorities can be cobbled together from major regulatory legislation. And that is situations where bipartisanship, or at least a certain amount of it, emerges temporarily, typically. And in these examples, that's been associated with new issues coming onto the political scene, and both parties, at least temporarily, or parts of both parties, competing to be identified with that issue. So in that early populist era and the early progressive era, you see the Republican Party trying to be identified with progressivism. That's what Teddy Roosevelt's campaigns were about, and ultimately he formed a third party because he lost the fight within the Republican Party to make it the Progressive Party. Democrats ultimately captured that issue. Same thing is true with environmentalism in the 70s or late 60s and 70s. Richard Nixon is the actor who created the EPA and signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and a bunch of other environmental bills. Republicans were trying to be the environmental party as late as George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency. He signed major amendments to the Clean Air Act and ran as the environmental president. And if you look back at that era, the 70s now, and you look at the ideological data I showed you earlier, and you look at Congress, you can sort of see how bipartisanship arose. The parties were a lot more ideologically heterogeneous. Remember, this is a distribution of the congressional members' ideology on a left-right scale. And so you can see that the most conservative Democrat was more conservative, more to the right of the most liberal Republican. And the median Republican was only a quarter of a point from zero, and a little over a half a point away from the median Democrat. If you compare that to today, the ideology in Congress today, you see a pretty stark difference. There is no overlap at all ideologically between Republicans and Democrats. There are no Republicans who are to the left of any Democrats. And also fairly strikingly, the median Republican has moved pretty far to the right in the intervening decades since the 1970s. So that's all very depressing. It makes Ted Halstead's dream of a bipartisan climate policy seem like a tall order. So what do we do about that? What can we do? Well, our only choice is to sort of face, those of us who care about a green transition, is to sort of face this reality and get to work. It appears that under the current configuration of the Republican Party, that means working to elect more Democrats, because regardless of what Republican voters want or some Republicans in Congress want, climate policy is going to be a non-starter in the Senate as long as Mitch McConnell is the majority leader. But I would also argue that Ted Halstead's dream isn't completely dead. Climate impacts really don't distinguish between, who's representing a particular district, and Republicans that represent climate impacted areas may already be starting to change their tune a little bit. I don't know how many of you saw that firebrand Trump supporter Matt Gaetz wrote recently that he thinks climate change is an urgent problem requiring action now. I never in a million years would have thought that that would be his position, but he represents Florida. And it may be that he's making a calculation that his electoral prospects are improved by acknowledging, reality, climate reality. So maybe climate reality will turn some GOP voters into advocates, or turn some GOP representatives into climate advocates, or turn some GOP voters into Democrats if their elected leaders don't respond. That's probably not going to happen instantly or in this election or maybe even in the next election. But remember, sharp change can happen. The New Deal majorities that I described to you earlier, they weren't created in one election. The 1930 election, Democrats made sort of modest, significant, but modest gains in both the House and the Senate. And then the next election, they made huge gains. And so when there are catastrophes like there was in 1930 and 32, like there is now, there's a possibility for sharp change. But in the meantime, I think what we have to do is we have to avoid succumbing to the idea that therefore we ought not to do much right now. We ought to do our best right now. My hope is that those of us who want a rapid transition do what we can do now and not succumb to the idea that half measures are the same as no measures. That's clearly not true. I mean, if we can reduce any emissions we reduce now, reduce future harms, I think that's obviously true. And so we should do what we can do now. And that means we're going to have to pay attention to the ideological center of Congress. Here's a picture of the ideology as measured by another score. This is a group called Progressive Punch, who measures levels of progressivism. And they identify these members as the least progressive Democrats in Congress. And if you look at them and the districts and the places they represent, these are people who have made Democratic seats out of really not very democratic districts. And these are people that have to answer to their constituents. They will raise questions about climate policy that involve trade-offs or costs or how the policy affects their constituents. That doesn't make them, as some people on Twitter would say, corrupt or in the pocket of industry or insufficiently brave or anything other than legislators who are doing what legislators do, protecting their prospects of re-election. So that's the reality we have to face in getting climate legislation passed in the next Congress, assuming that we get a Democratic majority in the Senate, which is by no means assured. Or frankly, in creating any big structural change. Right now, in connection with the replacement of Justice Ginsburg, you hear a lot of talk about adding judges to the Supreme Court, adding states to the Union, constitutional amendments. All that stuff goes through Congress, has to go through Congress, and it has to go through this group right here. And so we have to be cognizant of the pressures that this group is operating under. And so let me just bookend this presentation with another movie quote. I started with a movie quote. I'm going to give you a different movie quote. So this idea, this sort of general sense that we have to face reality and do our best within the constraints of reality is pretty well illustrated by this situation in the movie Apollo 13. You may remember when people, if you've seen the movie, people on the ground, including an astronaut named Ken Mattingly, are working in a simulator to try to figure out how to help the Apollo 13 crew restart their onboard computer systems, all the ones that are necessary for re-entry into the Earth's orbit. And they have to do this given that they've got almost no power in the batteries on the ship, very low levels of power. And after failing in the simulator several times, Mattingly sort of snaps at the young engineer you see there on the right, or portrayed there on the right, saying something to the effect of, we can't do what we need to do without all these systems. And the retort is this one you see right here. He says, Ken, look, you're telling me what you need. I'm telling you what we have to work with at this point. I'm not making this stuff up. And that's where we are right now in climate policy. We've got to avoid these internecine battles among climate advocates and find a way to do the best we can with the situation that we have while working toward a better situation. And I think the website that we operate, I hope, is helpful in that regard. I've taken up my time, I believe, so I'm just going to stop there and be available for additional questions.
Wonderful. First, I think it's really terrific. We're all very fortunate to be the beneficiaries of your expertise in political science and the political process. The kind of political economy of Congress and how it operates is very interesting, and I think that's a real contribution to this discussion. So as you pointed out, the environmental decades sort of began in 1969 with the signing of the National Environmental Policy Act, and arguably concluded in 1990 with George H.W. Bush signing the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Since 1990, Congress has only passed one major piece of environmental legislation. That was in 2016, amendments to the Toxic Substances Control Act. So right now, it doesn't appear that Congress is the actor that's going to move us toward a green energy transition, at least not right now under the current circumstances. And so you raise well, we've got to work with what we got. So my first question to you relates to the role of other important actors within society. You are obviously an expert on energy law and policy, and it is not solely the federal government that makes energy policy in the United States. The states play an extremely important role as well. In governing distribution systems, many states have adopted renewable portfolio standards. I wonder if you could address briefly the role that states play in the potential for a green energy transition as perhaps a second best, but an available option.
Yeah, and I focused exclusively here on national legislation, and there's lots of other fronts in this battle. And so let's start with states. So there are about 5 or 6 states that have created goals just like the one I announced, I articulated, that is net zero by 2050, sometimes more aggressive than that. And so there may be additional states where they adopt an aggressive decarbonization goal as well. And so that's progress. When I say I think we need national legislation to get to that nationally, that's because states like mine are never going to adopt a goal like that. And so that leaves the question of, well, what can we do on other fronts? And I think the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, despite being populated entirely by Trump appointees, is holding a technical conference on pricing carbon in wholesale power markets. I don't know what's people are sort of puzzled by that. I mean, this is not viewed as a really progressive majority in the FERC right now. But we'll see what comes of that, and the state of New York certainly wants to do that. That would be effectively like imposing a carbon tax on on the places where we have competitive wholesale power markets, and that's a lot of the electric sector. I don't know if that's likely to happen everywhere, but it might happen in New York. There's also executive actions that people put a lot of hope in. I tend to be a skeptic about using the Clean Air Act to effect major change on the carbon emission front. I think the act sort of using Section 111D as the Obama administration tried to do is a really difficult fit that, especially as the federal judiciary grows more conservative, it'll be difficult to get that through judicial review. So I tend to think we need Congress to say something about this, at least eventually, if we're going to get a national policy. But the other thing I would add that people shouldn't forget is that the market is doing work as well right now. That is, because wind and solar are cheap, big customers want access to it. big corporate customers want access to wind and solar power. They want to sign contracts with wind and solar generators, which creates a demand pull for more wind and solar. There is, the transmission barrier is still there, but there's tremendous market demand for it now. And if we could unlock the barrier to siting transmission, I think you'd unleash a whole bunch of private investment in building wind and solar because there's so much demand for it right now. This would effectively shut down coal almost everywhere in the country because the gap in price is so huge now. And that could go a long way. I spoke with a staff member from a member of Congress yesterday about, there are people trying to craft a federal siting regime for transmission. They're not optimistic because for whatever reason, it seems to be not that popular of an idea. I would recommend a good book by Russell Gold, the name of which has just fled my mind, but it's brand new and it's about clean energy, Kleinman Energy, which was a merchant transmission company that tried to site transmission for wind farms. Maybe someone in chat knows the name of the book. I can't remember, but it's a great book and it's a great story about how hard it is to build transmission.
That actually raises a question that I think it's worth taking a step back. You mentioned the barriers to siting and transmission, as well as the potential for a federal regime for transmission. Could you just briefly explain for those participants who might not know what regime we currently have for transmission and why a federal regime for transmission would be better?
Yeah, let me go back to my list of statutes here. So when the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act were passed as part of the New Deal, and they're sort of toward the bottom of that list, at that time, all power plants were built by investor-owned utilities or municipal utilities that served in a relatively small area. And so they built the power plants right near customers. And natural gas, on the other hand, could only be produced in certain parts of the country, but it was needed in the big cities everywhere. And so in the Natural Gas Act, you have a federal siting regime. That is, the basic approval for building pipelines comes from the federal government, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But for building transmission lines, you go to the state. At the time, we didn't think we needed a national regime for siting transmission lines. Now, the best, cheapest, cleanest power would be most efficiently generated in the windy center of the country and the sunny desert Southwest, and delivered over increasingly efficient high voltage transmission lines, great distances to markets, to cities. But we have to get permission from every state through which the line passes. And most states have kind of anachronistic siting provisions that create all kinds of opportunities to kill the line, to say nothing of the fact that if you're one of the states that the line just passes through, what incentive do you have to say yes to the line? So attempts to sort of deal with that issue so far have all been failures, abject failures, I would say. But there are some members of Congress who are trying to beef up provisions of the Federal Power Act that would help that process, would break down some of those barriers to entry.
And do you think that a step like that, it doesn't sound like a Green New Deal, right? So a Green New Deal raises all of these issues about partisanship that you were discussing in the second segment of your talk. Does something like having a federal regime for transmission lines raise the same biases, or do you think that is something that could potentially proceed and have a big effect without sort of raising the hackles?
Yeah, I don't think we quite have a full Green New Deal bill yet, but the resolution that was passed and the sort of prior versions of it seemed to envision federal ownership of both transmission and most of the new renewable generation. So in other words, that the federal government would do it directly, either through existing federal power marketing agencies or just by legislation. DOE could do it. In any case, and this is true even if under the existing regime, you have to use the process of eminent domain to acquire the easements to put the lines in. But certainly if you had a federal government doing it directly, you wouldn't have to worry. Presumably the Green New Deal legislation, when it's created, will preempt local approvals for siting transmission. Just as, and we could do that. So that would be to facilitate federal investment in this. We could do the same thing to facilitate private investment in this. Either would overcome that problem through force, the force of the supremacy clause, right?
So, given everything that you've said about the political structures that we have in place today and the implications of those political structures, as well as the favoring of rural interests, as well as the partisanship, we've received a question in the chat about, well, maybe instead of focusing on the specifics of climate change, maybe we ought to focus on reforming those structures instead, structures like the Electoral College or the underrepresentation of cities and urban interests as compared to rural interests. As a political science expert, what's your, as well as an energy policy expert, what's your view of that approach?
I certainly understand why people want to do that. The sort of fairness norms in the system have, in my opinion, been broken by the current version of the GOP. And so once you start to lose that shared sense of sort of rules of fair play, I think Republicans would argue that Democrats broke it before, but the history of how appointments are treated is sort of out there for anyone to look at. And so I think that the Garland appointment plus this action now with respect to Justice Ginsburg's seat, it's perfectly understandable that leads people to want to change the rules of the game. And frankly, I'd be delighted if it was possible to add additional states to create a Senate that can get us to where we need to be. I do think permanent minority rule or long-term minority rule is an unsustainable thing. It's not something that can continue very long, and especially when the party that's enjoying minority rule is trying to suppress votes and gerrymander in a more partisan way than Democrats used to partisanly gerrymander. But in any case, I understand that. I think it has to go. The problem is that all of these things would have to be created by the system that we have now. And unless you're talking about some non-majoritarian way of doing this, I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not it's likely to happen, or whether it's more likely than getting some Republicans on board with some good climate legislation.
All right, we only have about 2 minutes left. And so I want to give you the opportunity to share any concluding remarks or thoughts that you have with the group.
I think the sort of large takeaway here is that I really hope we can keep talking to one another civilly and respectfully, particularly within the Democratic and the pro-climate coalition, and it may be broader than the Democratic Party, but it doesn't seem to be a whole lot broader than that to me right now. But I do think that incivility and sort of name calling within that coalition undermines the willingness to talk to one another, to work out the kinds of problems that we're going to have to work out if we're going to create climate policy that's durable. And you need to look no further than the Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank to get pictures of efforts to deal with a huge problem that turned out, to be not nearly as effective as we hoped they'd be, because they were accomplished by bare majorities of one party. And so I think we need to sort of think about, no matter how frustrating and futile it sometimes seems, we need to think about building the broadest majority we can to work on these issues. And I hope people go visit the website and look at some of the scholarship that's there, because I think it helps shine a light on some of these issues. And thanks for everybody's attention, and thanks for having me.
Wonderful. If you will all join me in virtually thanking Professor Spence for being with us today. Thank you again, David. It's been a real pleasure.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.